This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Have you been thinking about therapy? Have you been trying to get in to see a therapist? Have you found that a lot of therapists that you've been recommended to have either closed books or they've got a really long waiting list? Sometimes months. If you're lucky, it's a couple of weeks. Now, what if there was an alternative that gave you quicker access and at your convenience? So when starting to think about looking for a therapist, try BetterHelp. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient and flexible to your schedule needs. So just fill out the brief questionnaire and get matched with a registered therapist. You can also switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So get moving with therapy and visit BetterHelp. BetterHelp.com/Gunter today will give you 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Gunter, GUNTER.
Listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter Swoboda. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. I'm your host. Welcome to today's episode of Insights into Humanity, which is a little sub-podcast to Inspire Change with Gunter. And these particular podcasts are where we want to delve into the minds shaping our understanding of the human condition. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to have Professor Greg Downey with us, who's a leading anthropologist known for his immersive research and thought-provoking insights into human nature and culture. Professor Downey, welcome to the show.
Oh, Gunter, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're absolutely welcome. Now, we're programmed to do 50 to 60 minutes, but I'm sure you and I could probably spend a week chatting and still not have covered what it is that we really want to cover.
Yeah.
So to get the ball rolling, it's okay if I call you Greg?
Of course, Gunter. Please
All right. Do. Thank you. So how about we start from the beginning? Okay. So not the first months of gestation, but
mom and dad got together. Yeah.
You know the story. Can you give us like your bio from child, high school, university, adulthood, all that sort of stuff?
I can give you a quick version of this. I was born in Chicago in the U.S. and raised in St. Louis. I was raised in a really homogeneous community out in the suburbs west of St. Louis. St. Louis is a really segregated city, so the community I grew up in was really dominantly Catholic and kind of middle class, upper middle class, American, highly educated. Grew up around dentists and doctors and CPAs. My father was an accountant. My mother was a dietitian, and went to all Catholic schools, primary through 8th grade, then all Catholic high school, all boys. Studied under the Jesuits, thought I was going to become a priest, and then had my first girlfriend, decided maybe priest wasn't such a great idea. Went away to the University of Virginia because I really wanted to get out of St. Louis. I really wanted to see the world, and I had a taste for, understanding more than just my home. Went to Virginia because it was on the East Coast and south of Washington, D.C. And to make a long story short, I thought I was going to be studying business and law, and at the time Japan was the great rival to the U.S. I thought I was going to study Japanese and go into business law, but I went to an anthropology class, and about 2 weeks into the anthropology class, I was like, "Holy smoke! You can do this for like a living? So I thought, I'm going to do this anthropology thing as long as I can. And when I have to get a real job, I'll do it. And I've never had to get a real job. I've always been an anthropologist and really enjoyed just gotten up every morning knowing I enjoy what I do, Well, except for the mornings when I have all day long staff meetings. But other than that, and then I came to Australia 2005 and settled in Australia. And I've been working at Macquarie University in here. Loving Australia, So that's kind of the short version of how I got here.
Okay, well, if you're open to coming on to another program, we can maybe dive a little bit deeper into that in the next episode. But let's stay with the short version. So I can really identify with your experience of, this wow with anthropology, because I had the same experience in psych. Where I had signed up for a double major in psychology and philosophy, mainly because philosophy was never going to give me a job, a real job. So psychology was fundamentally it. And I didn't really know what academic psychology was going to look like until a friend of mine said, "Listen, I've got to go to uni." And there's a lecture. It's 2 hours. I know it's going to be really boring, but if we go together, we can go for a surf. Well, he fell asleep in 10 minutes and I was hooked. It's like, where do I sign up? That was my reaction. So what do you think it was that clicked with you in anthropology?
Yeah, look, I was fascinated with cultural diversity, the diversity of humanity. And the more unusual it was from my perspective, the more different it was to what I grew up with, the more I was interested. Like I was really, I was kind of looking for that. I wanted to understand the breadth of human experience. I'd fallen in love with other cultures, with ancient history, with, South African music, was really interested in East Asia. And to me, anthropology was the place where people were talking the most about those ways of life. I took psychology, I took political science, I took other classes, economics, but where I really felt most engaged was feeding my curiosity about just how weird and wild humans could be. And I got that from that first 2 weeks in anthropology. About week 2, I was already, this is amazing. And it was even more vast, the human diversity that I saw, than what I had expected coming out of high school in St. Louis. I thought I knew what multiculturalism was in cultural diversity. I'd eaten sushi. I'd done a few intercultural things. I was not prepared for just how profoundly different people could be and their worldviews could be.
Yeah, I came from a very similar background in the sense that I was very white, very vanilla, So coming to Australia was a real sort of eye-opener just in of itself, despite the fact that we moved to a relatively, white, vanilla environment. But there was the story of the Aboriginal people. And that was one of the things that really fascinated me very early on, and especially the social injustice in that area.
That touched me too. I was a door-to-door salesman when I was at university to help put myself through school to help pay the bills. And one summer I got sent out to Wisconsin to the dairy farms, and I went door to door meeting dairy farmers. That kind of blew my mind. And then next summer they sent me to New Mexico, and New Mexico was really fascinating. Not only were there Latino families, but there was huge enclave of Mormon families, and then there were Native American groups in the area that I was working with. So I would go from a house where I'd meet a Mormon family to a house where I'd meet a Latino extended family to a house where there'd be Hickory Apache or folks from the Navajo reservation living there. And it was really a chance to see that. I think a lot of us look and we just assume everybody's kind of like us. It's just a safe assumption, everybody's kind of like us. We're all human. We're all the same. And the more that I got into it, the more I realized it's not actually true. That we're not all the same. Motivations are not identical. People are profoundly different, and they have really different experiences.
Yeah. No, that's a really important insight. I think one of the things that I always felt was that in psychology, we got a very Western vanilla flavored academic program. And that, that's always sort of sat in the background of my mind, is that, hang on a minute, we're really coming at this. And the only time that sort of got challenged when Isaac, the guy who was the IQ guy, came to our university, or was supposed to come to our university, and we basically got him off the program because of his position on African American intelligence, basically saying that they're different. And so that was the first real run-in that I had, in a sense, with how deep prejudice can actually be, even within the scientific community.
It's massive, and there's the prejudices of people who set out with an axe to grind and find the data to support it. So they're convinced in advance that racial groups are real and that there's real differences, and so they go out and they find the data, they cherry pick what they need to get it to say that. But there's also the bias that comes from just not recognizing how different people can be, and I think that's almost more insidious, because you don't have to be a bad person to just not recognize that we're not all alike. And so you can't just assume that, well, since I like X, everybody's going to like X. And that, I think, happens a lot in psychology, where people will survey their undergraduate students in an intro class, and the undergraduate students will say, oh, I like this, I'm sexually attracted to this, or my morality is this way. And they'll just assume that that's human nature.
Yes.
And that they can generalize from a group of undergraduate psychology students in Minnesota or Victoria, Australia, or Bristol or something, and they think that they can just universalize. And it's really dangerous, not just because it's not true, but also because I think it underrepresents the real freedom we have to determine who we are. If you think human nature is one way, you never say, well, wait, maybe we could be different. Maybe we could change ourselves. Maybe this isn't inherent in our DNA or in our very nature, that we are consumerists or we're materialists or whatever it is. I think that's what anthropology does for me, is not just that I'm curious, but also I think it's a message about liberty and choice, and human ways of life could be a lot of different paths. We have to think about that.
Yeah. So let me bring it to a bit of a sort of pointy end, because we're going to have people listening to us talk and wax lyrically here. But I'm going to assume that some people, who are listening to me generally, may not exactly know how to define anthropology. So you're flawed, Greg.
Yeah. Look, if you got a room of 20 anthropologists, you have 21 different definitions of anthropology. That's probably the way.
I had a feeling that.
Yeah, but for me, anthropology is holistic study of human diversity. When I say holistic, that means we don't just carve out one layer or realm. It's not just economy or sociology or religion, but the idea that you study people, you got to study how those things relate to each other. So anthropologists have, in the Western academia, they have tended to be the folks who go out and study indigenous groups, who study minority groups, who go outside of Western, rich, Euro-American countries, and they study groups on the fringe and bring that back. Not just, maybe some of them to catalog, the exotic or curiosities, but also for most of us, not because we think that's exotic, but we just think it's human. And so therefore we need to understand it. You can't understand child rearing if all you know is Western child rearing with cribs and formula and stuff like that. How are you going to really know what a baby's patterns are if you don't look at babies in different situations? So anthropology, I'd say, bottom line, study of human diversity. And that includes biological, cultural, social, all dimensions of human diversity.
Yeah, I like that. That's a really neat way of describing it.
Yeah.
So now let's bring in your areas of research, because I know that you've done some field work, and I'm really curious about that. And I'm sure our listeners are going to be curious about it as well, and how that ties in with your interests as you progressed.
Look, I am a weird anthropologist in that I like to jump around a lot. So I did a lot of research on African diaspora cultures in the New World. In particular, I got really interested in Brazil. And I was interested in music, but then I became interested in Brazil. And transitioned to studying an Afro-Brazilian martial art called capoeira. So I did years of field work, practiced it, taught it, did very traditional what they call capoeira Angola, the traditional form of the art that hasn't been sort of turned into a phys ed, physical fitness regime. Then I also got interested in land rights and small farmers in Brazil. I did some work in Fiji. I've done work in Australia. I became interested in the more I did the capoeira research, the more I became interested in how culture influenced neurology and how psychology functions. Because the capoeira guys were always saying that if you do capoeira, it's going to change how you perceive things, going to change your senses, going to change your balance, going to change how you walk around in the city. I was like, wow, this is kind of interesting. So I became interested in cases where people use practices like sports, martial arts, things like that to change how they perceive. And so lately I've been working on how blind people learn to perceive. So working with a guy who is a blind activist and teacher who teaches echolocation or kind of human sonar.
Yeah.
I've been interested in free diving, how folks learn to hold their breath for 8 minutes, 6, 7, 8 minutes, some cases. But then also I'm interested in looking at how men try to change themselves. And I'm interested in, this is a weird one. I'm interested in tabletop role-playing games where people imagine other worlds to see how they create together. So I'm doing a lot of projects, I'd say sports, training, you can tell. I've been doing this for 30 years, so it sort of makes sense. I've covered some turf.
Absolutely. Well, you're crossing on one of my territories, which is the whole story about men.
Yeah.
And the forever debate about what's nature and what's nurture and all of that. But you just piqued my interest.
Yep.
When I was at an undergrad, used to play Dungeons and Dragons.
Yep.
Heaps. Really interesting.
That's there's a lot of people interested in simulation and in how you teach people stuff. So it turns out that games get used like disaster management. They'll do disaster games, right? You like, if you're going to learn to be a person in primary medical care, they'll give you an actor who acts like a patient and you got to, games are really an important part of teaching people. And I think games like Dungeons and Dragons, and there's a bunch more, are ways that people imagine worlds, cosmologies, religions. So it's kind of like a little incubator for, you could see it as an incubator for thinking about like, what would a worldview, how could a worldview come about? So it's just it's kind of a tool to think about human imagination and how we imagine together,
I mean, one of the areas in therapy that I got interested in was sand play, which I really relate to what you're talking about. Which is often very profound on the person who's involved in the sand play. Really interesting stuff. The other one that I'm thinking about is the constellation work, where you have a group of people and they act out parts of a family's system. You referenced something that I'm really, really interested in, and that is the impact of culture on neurology. Tell me a bit more about that, Greg.
Well, I initially got interested in it because the folks I was working with in Brazil made claims that were kind of like neurological claims. And when I first wrote the research up, I just said, the Brazilian capoeira practitioners, they tell me that they can see in their peripheral vision better than folks who don't do capoeira. I just wrote it down, like this is what they say. And then when I got back to the United States and I was writing all this stuff up, I'm like, is this plausible? Does it make sense? And at the time, this was sort of 2005, 2006, there was a lot of data really coming out on human biology. The human genome was sequenced and it was discovered that there weren't really that many genes. And in fact, we varied. Basically, as soon as one human genome was sequenced, people realized, you actually got to sequence a lot of these because there is no one human genome. There's just lots of different human genomes in each of us. And then at the same time, some stuff was coming out of neurosciences where people were saying the brain is not as fixed as we thought it was. The brain is actually trainable. It's plastic. So what you do when very early with a child can influence how it functions later. And this made complete sense to an anthropologist because we know that infants, if there's examples like if an infant has a language when they're born that identifies aromas, scents, smells, they can learn to be very accurate with classifying aromas. Whereas if your language doesn't have aroma words, you're lousy at it. You're terrible at it. And you can't pass a test that the person with the language with aroma terms can pass. If you have different set of color terms, it shows up neurologically. If you've got a vocabulary of 5 color terms, it changes the way that your visual processing works. So the more we looked at these examples, and that's kind of what I got into writing about, the more we realized, in fact, culture has severe consequences. But it's not culture like what you say out in the open. It's the day-to-day practices. It's the things you're exposed to over and over again. Like what kind of play do you do as a child? How do your parents handle you? What kind of educational experiences? So yeah, I think that to me, neuroanthropology, which is kind of a specialty I've sort of worked in, is just an attempt to bring the insights from neurosciences and anthropology into conversation. Because we can't always do brain imaging to solve every problem. Brain imaging is hard to do, and you can't do brain imaging on somebody when they're running around or playing capoeira. So you gotta make the two sciences talk to each other.
Yeah.
That'd be the way I'd put it.
Well, what I'd like to see is, psychology coming into that conversational space between the neuro, the anthro, because, my work with men, has very clearly identified the impact of, patriarchal socialization on even at a subconscious level, we operate. I mean, I catch myself out at times where I go, that's my programming. That's the only reason why I reacted like this.
Look, psychology is a big part of this. I mean, I say neurosciences, but I'm really talking neuropsychology. And for a long time, I was the editor of the Journal for Psychological Anthropology. I did that for 5 years. And some of the best examples we have are kind of from this mix of psychology, neuros. One example is research that was done on cultures with a really strong sense of honor. So some of those studies where in southern United States, sort of Appalachian United States, where there's a really strong like masculine honor, where your word is your bond, and I take offense to that, sir. If you put those folks through experiments, they have different physiological responses to being insulted. They react in a much more extreme way on a level they can't even control to something like to challenges to their honor. So there was a great research project that looked at how men who, after they've had, sort of a manipulation, like having their honor questioned or something, they've been primed. How when they walk down the hall afterwards, they sent an actor up the hall to see if the man stepped out of the way or refused to step out of the way. And people and folks from these cultures, if they had had their sense of honor provoked, wouldn't move. It's almost like they're not even thinking about it consciously, but they're defending their sense of self physically. Like, I'm not going to get out of my space for you.
That's the territorial response that I talk about.
Exactly. And that's in some patriarchal societies that's really exaggerated, and in others it's less so. Brazil, where I worked, there's definitely patriarchal structures, but they're very different. And it's interesting. One of the reasons I got interested in capoeira was I could tell it had this kind of like violent masculine thing, but it also had a huge focus on theatricality and performance. So all the guys who do capoeira, they're tough as nails, but they also sing beautifully. They play instruments. They can dance. So it was a different constellation of stuff that was sort of put together for masculinity there. And I found that really intriguing. It wasn't like they weren't masculine. It's like they were a different masculinity. They were. It wasn't exactly the same, nor was it the opposite.
It's like R.W. Connell says, masculinities rather than masculinity.
Exactly. And that's within a society, but that's also from one culture to the next. Like even within a culture, even within one single society, you probably see difference between masculinities between classes, like different, working class masculinity is different to a highly educated masculinity. There's groups within, and many times they're aware of it, but not like in an analytical way, but in a visceral way, like that man's not masculine enough, or I don't trust that type of man, kind of thing, or this guy is a good old boy, or I feel comfortable with him, he's more like me. And so that emotional resonance makes complete sense. But that's a kind of cultural difference. I don't really care whether it's between two different cultures or between a class. To me, it's all interesting. All this diversity is interesting.
Yeah. Well, again, this is, where I sort of I started working with men who were Vietnam veterans. And that was like, initially I came at it completely as a psychologist. Okay, I'm dealing with people who've been traumatized. And then one of the things that led to me going, hang on a minute, I need to open up. I need to open my field of perception up, was because one of the things that came into play was what I call the moral injury. And then I discovered that there's actually differences in how people were morally injured, how these soldiers, how they took it. And it just strikes a chord when you talked about that, the Appalachian guys, and about how they're holding territory when they've been sort of challenged before, So that was one of the early pieces.
I think, look, I think psychology and anthropology, I mean, obviously I'm in an area where those two habitually talk to each other in my research, but I don't think enough of those conversations are going on. I think a lot of psychologists and a lot of people out there in the world, even in human resources, in, team management and coaching, they're running into cultural differences in these values, these core fundamental, what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to be a good parent? How do I provide for my family? And as they run into clients who come from different backgrounds, you recognize that the same advice, the same effects they don't work for every person. And as a teacher, I see it, in front of the classroom. I realize that I've got to be careful about the conversation I'm having, because I really want to draw everyone into the conversation. Because if I just speak to folks like me, I'm missing too much of the audience, and it's not going to hit with the same force as if I can figure out what will appeal to other types of people. If I just lecture to other guys like me, I leave too many students behind, and that's not what I want to do. I want to help be the mentor to a generation that doesn't look exactly like this generation in academia, in leadership, and whatever.
No. That's what I love about our work. So here's sorry, go on.
I was gonna say, you never stop learning, and you never I hope I never stop challenging myself. I joke that I want to make myself obsolete, but not too soon. I want to raise the people and train them who will make my forms of knowledge obsolete. But I still got a few more years to go before I'm ready to step away.
Well, I'm ready for a legacy process as well. Not too soon, though.
Not too soon.
If ever. So let's talk about this discipline called psychological anthropology. So you've given me a good, sort of definition of anthropology. One of the things that I was aware of when I was in an undergrad and doing, intro psych, and then we had to do sociology, intro anthropology, that it was I perceived it as a narrow field at the time. And we're talking late 70s, very early 80s. Right. It was all, my course was all about kinships and all that sort of stuff. And, I look at a graph and I still do, and I sort of go a bit blurry eyed and, whereas at least in psychology, we were doing some interesting stuff. Didn't like the stat, but I like the other stuff to it. And then, getting into psychopathology and all that got me tingly. So psychological anthropology, what is that thing, Greg?
Yeah, look, you're right. Anthropology traditionally saw itself as like the discipline that studied the colonized peoples, or the indigenous cultures. And, that got to be less and less interesting. First of all, a lot of what was going on in indigenous cultures and in colonized peoples, you couldn't explain just by looking at them like they were timeless, because they were Westerners there. There was trade. They were changing. Those people were changing.
Yeah.
And more anthropologists grapple with this, the more you see new stuff happening. So 70s, 80s, 90s, when I was in graduate school, there's just like an explosion of creativity in the field. But one of the things that anthropologists got burned on in the middle of the 20th century, especially the 50s and 60s, was at the time psychology was really universalizing. So psychology was under the thrall of the idea of human instincts and human nature and universal traits. So anthropologists just kind of got burned talking to these people. They would say like, oh, there's a universal form of the family, and anthropologists knew damn well that wasn't true. They would say, oh, there's a universal form of grammar, following Noam Chomsky. Anthropologists, linguists and anthropologists say, none of these indigenous languages are like that. What are you talking about? So we kind of felt like we were dealing with people who just were refusing to see, like we'd bring our evidence to the table and they would just say, well, it wasn't done in a laboratory. Well, these people don't live near laboratories. If you want to study Native American languages, if you want to study indigenous people who aren't culturally assimilated, you got to get in the truck and go. You gotta go to them. And so I think for a lot of anthropologists, psychology became a dirty word. We would say, we would actually criticize each other for psychologizing, which was for anthropologists was going and saying, oh, that's a universal instinct. That's a universal masculine trait. That's a universal aspect of parenting. Because anthropologists knew that stuff was, it wasn't true. So psychological anthropology is a reaction to say, no, actually, you can take some of the tools of psychology and the questions of psychology, and you can go back into those settings and you get really interesting answers. If you want to look at attachment, for example, instead of just looking for families like yours, let's look for a family structure that's totally different. And let's see what happens to attachment. For example, there's matriarchal societies where the father doesn't really have strong relationships with the son and daughter, where the uncle, the mother's brother, is the stronger disciplinarian. So let's see what happens. Is there an Oedipal complex in this society? What does it look like? Let's go to a place that doesn't have strong private property. Is self-formation the same when kids don't have their own bedrooms or their own toys? Let's go to a place where young children look after young children, where 7-year-olds look after 4-year-olds. Do they have the same developmental stages and milestones? And for me, this is super fascinating because you start to see how when you change other variables, the human psyche changes and adapts. So that, I would say psychological anthropology right now is still a bit of an outlier. Anthropologists don't fully trust us, and psychologists don't fully trust us. We're not the favorites of either of them. But it's such a, when I go to the conferences, what I'm amazed by are just the sheer breadth of what people are talking about and the number of interesting examples. What is moral formation like in different societies? What happens? Gender's a great one. Masculinity. What is masculinity like in all of these societies, which have really different roles? And there's a lot of research that shows that most psychology research is only done on Western subjects. I've heard it said as much as 88% or 92% of all research is done on Western subjects. So we got a really skewed sample to understand what's. And at the same time, we got to realize that there's parts of the world where some of that cultural diversity is decreasing. That cultures are under sometimes intentional pressure to assimilate, sometimes unintentional, just the market or job opportunities, educational opportunities. Whether it's, for example, how China deals with its minority groups, how Australia has dealt with its indigenous groups. There's pressure to assimilate. And
I mean, the classic that stands out for me is the Maori and the Hawaiian community, the indigenous community, and they're being pushed off land too now.
Yeah. And Hawaii is a great case. One of my professors in grad school studied Hawaii, and just fascinating how when the first sailors came, when Captain Cook came to Hawaii, how the Hawaiian cosmology, their understanding of their gods, influenced the way that those two groups interacted, even though the Europeans had no idea what was going on from the Hawaiian point of view. They didn't understand it, but it was shaping how they interacted.
Yeah. Fascinating stuff. So, the future. Let's move a little bit into the future. What do you see as some of the important issues, both from a psychological, anthropological, anthropological perspective? I mean, you and I are talking about masculinity a lot.
Yeah. Look, I mean, there's so many I could talk about. I'll talk about one that's sort of close to the core of psychology, which is I think that there's a lot of a discomfort with the way that mental health is being handled in a lot of psychology. That there's a sense that maybe prescribing drugs isn't the best way to go. There is a discussion about whether assuming anybody who's different is disorder. There's the neurodiversity movement, for example. There's folks who talk about how the approach to hearing voices in the West actually makes it harder for people to recover and to integrate into society. You know, I think there's a discussion right now about whether, you know, psychology as a helping profession needs to think more broadly and back up from some of the assumptions. Let's not just have another edition of the DSM, but maybe we should rethink more profoundly what we're doing. You know, maybe depression is not just a imbalance of chemicals. Maybe depression is actually multiple different conditions that we're collapsing into one. And in fact, depression may be a very reasonable response, for example, to lousy living conditions. You know, it might be a defensive strategy that people are.
Yeah.
So I think for me, that one thing is there's obviously a lot of disquiet within the West about how we understand psychology. But then where anthropology comes in is there's a lot of other models out there that we haven't considered that we could bring to the table. You know, whether it's African models or Latin American models of psychology, whether it's indigenous concepts. You know, it's not just caring for indigenous people, but maybe some of those concepts should and can cross over more broadly. You know, I think about the way, for example, mindfulness and Buddhism has influenced people who don't necessarily grow up in a Buddhist tradition. But those techniques have become useful. There's probably a lot more out there. Humanity has been running lots of parallel experiments in how to be a healthy human being, and we should look at some of the results from elsewhere. You know, and that's what growing up in a very homogeneous community made me. I guess I appreciate it more, but also made me hungry for is what are some of the other solutions to these problems?
Yeah. I mean, there's so many moral and ethical questions that are basically hanging over psychology at the moment. You know, I mean, I've seen a system that's gone from being very multidisciplinary over 25, 30 years, becoming essentially a medicalized model. And, you know, personally, I'm not really happy with that. The problems that we have with psychopharmaceuticals is widespread. Whereas, you know, we know and this is clinical research, that things like psilocybin, for example, when microdosing has a better effect on things like anxiety and depression.
There's other, for example, one of the things we know is that we're trying to solve social problems with psychological solutions. And I think that one of the things that I'd encourage is look at our sociology, you know, to look at the way we're interacting, to look at things like personal, you know, mobile phones and the way they're affecting kids, to look at the way schooling is changing. For example, one thing I ran into in Brazil when I was there is a very different approach to things like, you know, even schizophrenia, profound mental disorder, you might say, profound mental difference, where they do things like the theater of the insane, where they let people actually enact and interact with each other in a much more open and creative way. One thing that I think Westerners believe that they are the most individualized, you know, technologically advanced society. But I think one of the things that anthropology is showing us is that there's lots of ways to be advanced. I mean, Brazil is very advanced in its own way. It's very sophisticated how it understands human flourishing. South Korea is very interesting You know, that their Japanese ideas are very different. You know, there's I think Western technological economic dominance has made us assume that our philosophy and our psychology is also dominant, and that's not necessarily the case. You know that.
Yeah, it's hubris.
And I learned a lot about being a man from living in Brazil. I learned a lot about human happiness from being in Brazil.
Yeah. I mean, certainly, you know, I've met a few Brazilian psychoanalysts, and they have a much broader perspective, which I really appreciated. Certainly in my training in psychotherapy, you know, and then I worked with George Rosner, who spent an enormous amount of time with Hopi Indians and the shamanistic traditions and how that plays out, and so how to introduce that into, for example, psychodrama. You know, but those therapeutic approaches have become less and less, not just popular, but economically almost impossible to deliver, because it takes, you know, more than a 50-minute psychotherapy session. It needs a group. It needs, you know, a couple of hours. It needs continuity. And I know one of the restrictions I have in private practice is that, you know, you're sort of locked into this 50-minute session.
Yeah.
You know, and a lot of people privately can't afford a weekly session. They can only afford it once every 2 or 3 weeks. And so trying to keep momentum going becomes very difficult.
I think that we have to think more broadly than just that therapeutic model. I mean,
I agree.
When I lived in Brazil, one of the things I saw was candomblé and macumba and different kinds of religious practices of possession. And these sorts of rituals where people become possessed by the gods and they will dance for hours are a form of therapy, because folks go to the candomblé, to the house where the spirits are, because they have problems. They have psychological problems, they have relationship problems. And then they participate in this ongoing religious practice. And it's not a model of, you know, I'm going to sit down one-on-one with somebody and they're going to get compensated by an insurance company. You know, I just think, and that's unfortunately that is our answer to so many things, is whether it's childcare or education or therapy, it's how do we turn it into a business where somebody is responsible for paying an hourly wage to somebody for delivering it. And maybe we need more festivals. Maybe we need, you know, maybe we need more men's sheds. Maybe we need more, you know, open workshops or community art projects or things like that, you know, community theater, because we're not just seeing the rise of a certain kind of psychology, we're also seeing the disappearance of a whole range of social institutions, you know, like rural show societies, you know, bachelor and spinster dances, all this stuff, you know.
I see that as the sort of the consequences of this radical individualism that's overtaken our culture and has been driven home again and again and again, you know, basically disintegrating the real connectivity between individuals into a much more communitarian form. Because it is, I've worked with a lot of groups and I've seen the profound change, even as a facilitator and not doing a lot, that happens within a group that's actually got into that working process. It's not me doing anything, you know, cryptic or professional.
I mean, there are pockets of this. I mean, I participated in 12-step programs, and that's a really interesting example. Although you know, I had issues with the overwhelming Christianity of the setting, and you know, but like there was community, and there was lack of judgment, and there was lack of a commercial return. I think you're right. I mean, even institutions like a university, which are supposed to be about other goals, have become individualized service delivery for job placements. And so we're told over and over again to treat our students like they're customers. And it's, you know, it's profoundly unsettling, and it disrupts other kinds of relationships. You know, dating has been turned into, you know, you have to have an app and it's treated as though it's a job search. People put up their resumes / profiles and they screen each other like they're, you know, human resources managers. So many things, we've taken that model from consumerism and we've put it into places, whether it's religion, education, and it doesn't belong, and in the process, it does violence to those other kinds of social relations, and I mean, there's cases now in some parts of the world where, folks are paid just to be friends,
Yeah.
where, literally you see this is the kind of this overrun of this logic of service provision, childcare. Families have been extended families have been broken down, communities have been broken down. People don't trust their neighbors.
Yeah.
So you got to go to the daycare, which people have certificates. Everybody gets paid. It's to me, what I see is that we're ramming every kind of social relationship into a one size fits all template based on the market, and that's really not healthy for us. We feel
No,
isolated.
absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I think that's directly linked to the increase in, mental health issues.
Yep.
The connection between anxiety, depression, the sort of quasi neurological issues like ADHD, autism, all those sort of things. We talk about inclusivity, but it's a pseudo inclusivity because each of those are like a silo onto themselves. So on Facebook, you see this individualized group. If you've got ADHD, you belong to this group.
Yeah.
Well, hang on, can I talk to this group?
Well, at university, you can see it. We're told to worry about accessibility. And does that mean that we welcome students who are different and go out of our way and spend some time on getting to know them? No, it means that we put everything online so that people can watch from home. So they lose that chance to meet each other, to talk to people not like themselves. The irony is that the rationale for it is accessibility and inclusion, but the outcome is the opposite. It's the fact is, online education is really hard to do, and most people don't do it well. So it means that fewer students have good experiences. So under the banner of inclusivity, we actually make it less inviting, less warm, less human, less connected. And it leaves students feeling more likely to be depressed and anxious. And lo and behold, we have higher indices of students seeking help for depression and anxiety.
And dropping out.
And dropping out, yeah.
I work with a large number of students per year where it's like, by hook or crook, trying to keep them at university and getting them to explore the community rather than simply, getting in, getting out for my lectures, tutes, and labs.
I teach more students and know fewer students now than ever before in my career. I teach more and I know fewer. I don't know their names. I don't have interactions with them week to week. They don't come to the lectures. I get emails from them. I don't know who they are. It's really, and for me as a professional, it's much less satisfying because here I am hoping to help people build, futures and discover their intellectual passions. And what I'm getting is emails and, on a Zoom call with blank screens, talking to what feels like the electronic equivalent of an empty lecture hall. And so I think we have to realize that we can't do everything, but we can do fewer things better. We can't have so many relationships, but we can have more good ones. We can have fewer good ones. So you can't do every activity. You can't go to the gym and do everything and do it in a deep way. It's more important to have meaningful places that you feel home, that you feel welcome, you feel connected to each other. And there's a lot of societies where that's more common. I always tell the story about in Brazil. On Friday afternoon, I would walk home from my field research to my apartment, which was in a working class complex. And there were all these little sheds in the parking lot, and all the sheds would be opening up, and the folding chairs would be coming out of the sheds, and people would be carting down milk crates with cold beers, and they would start selling beers at the folding chairs, and people would pull out instruments and start playing, and they would sing the carnival songs from the previous years that they all knew. The loudest guy would lead the song. They were call and responses, and they would go for hours, and people would make music and dance and laugh. And I would walk past and they would shout, "Hey, American, come sit with us." They all knew who I was because they were gossiping like crazy. And you just felt like you were in a community. And if I didn't show up for 2 weeks, they would ask where I'd been. They would know. And Did it feel intrusive? Sometimes. I wasn't going to be bringing home a girlfriend without somebody noticing, but it also felt like that people had my back, and that they were looking out for me at the same time.
Yeah. You wouldn't die and no one noticed for 3 years.
Yeah, exactly. Or, if something happened to you on the way home, somebody would stop because they knew who you were and they'd feel connected to you.
Yeah.
It's a different, and I don't think it's a West versus other people difference. I think it's a atomized society where more and more of our relationships are based on our credit cards, and it makes it really hard. Because if somebody offers you a beer now, you like, what's the scam? Right?
Yeah. Where's the hook?
And if somebody wanted to put out folding chairs and sell beers in the street in a parking lot, the police would be called. That they didn't have the proper documents to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So I do feel like we're really making some decisions culturally that we're going to regret in the long term.
Yeah, I'm going to stick my neck out here and I'll go, this is to a large degree because the social ideology went into political ideology, neoliberalism, and we have allowed economists and political ideologists on the right to engineer society into this without any, boundaries.
This is something that anthropologists have been talking about a lot. That the economics acts like it's a science devoid of value, but in fact, it's a form of ideology. It's a form of religion. That getting a business degree is becoming part of an inner elite who all uses the same logic, not because it is the only logic, but because if they all agree on it, it's powerful, and they can. So there's some really good anthropologists out there who study things like marketing firms, who study business schools, as not as the sources of truth, but as cultural institutions like a church or like an ideology, and they're very successful ideological institutions. But boy, we've just trended way over to the social critique version of this. I'm worried I'm taking you away from psychological anthropology. And
well, no, see, my argument is they're interconnected. Like I have turned down a number of jobs about going into a company and setting up a wellness program when I discovered that in each of these companies, the culture was so toxic and there was a complete refusal at addressing the leadership culture and the silos and the level of politicizing that goes on. Yeah. And they go, well, and I'm going, hang on a minute, you've got a culture that's ill and you're expecting people to do a few, breathing, meditation courses, how to think rationally about life.
Absolutely.
And, I won't do it.
I had a student who did research on this, and she was looking at junior doctors. And Laura, if you're out there, you can hear this. She was looking at how mindfulness was being introduced. One of the things that came up in her thesis was junior doctors were under incredible stress. They're sort of bottom of the totem pole. At the same time, they have huge responsibilities. They're expected to make judgment calls when they're very new. They're often left alone on the weekends because everybody else is off, taking their time off. And she found that one of the things that they did was there was a machine which it took like 2 minutes to give a reading. So you put the sample in and you had 2 minutes. And they actually put a sticker on the machine saying like, take a mindfulness break while you wait for the results. Like literally you're expected to jam in your mindfulness activity in the little 2-minute gap that you had while the technology was working. And that was supposed to help your mental health. When in fact, you're being overworked, you're given too many hours a week. So I think that there's another interesting example is the whole idea of diversity training and diversity initiatives. Diversity is essential. I've talked about it a lot in this interview. But if your attempt to help make a workplace more suitable for women and people of different genders, gay, lesbian, transgendered, is just a day in which people put on rainbows and you have an event which a lot of the people who most need the message are not going to attend the event. If that's your effort, then you're not really sincere about wanting to make a change and make that organization embrace all those people. It's lipstick on a pig. It's icing on a mud pie. Call it what you want. It's not real change.
Yeah, unfortunately, I also see that with value statements in corporations as well.
Mm.
How closely are your actions aligned with those values that you've stuck up on the board?
Yeah. Yeah. No,
And the
you're
quality of leadership.
and what are the actual practices? Have you
Mm,
changed the incentive structure? Have you
mm,
changed the reporting structure? Have you changed,
mm,
like, for example, we're told to be creative, and yet we're given structures that it takes a year and a half to change something. You know,
mm,
you can't be creative in an environment in which the bureaucracy is strangling you.
mm,
You can't orient towards other values if your incentive structure is purely based on sales numbers or,
mm.
amount of revenue returned. Like, you have to actually change the day-to-day construction of people's incentives and their
Yeah,
interactions.
yeah. So here's some, a little segue, but I think it's still
Mm.
very, very relevant. Personal reflections and advice, Greg. Now, I'll leave that for you to shape up, right? But, if you reflect on your journey, and, both you and I have come a long way in our professions, uh, what sort of, like, let's take the students, okay? You've spoken a bit about, so what sort of advice would you give to aspiring anthropologists? Now, let me give you a counterpoint. When I thought about doing philosophy as a major, because I was
Mm-hmm.
good at it, I was told there's no jobs in it and you're going to starve to death. Now, unfortunately, I wasn't mature enough to go, hang on a minute, let me check with some people in the game,
Mm.
right? I just went, oh, okay. So therefore, I love psychology. That's the alternative. That's going to give me a profession. It's going to give me that meal ticket, you see.
Mm.
So again, what would you suggest to aspiring anthropologists?
Oh, it's a really great question. I think it's a really practical degree. I think but what I would say is the student should find the thing that makes them feel passionate about what they're doing, and they should
Mm,
throw themselves in with as much energy as they can. Because what we see too often is students who are afraid. They're at the university, but they're afraid about the future, or they don't even want to think about it. They're just there hoping that maybe they'll get a job at the end of this process, but they're not doing anything they care about. One of the reasons why I did anthropology is it was very easy to go to the classes. You know, I wanted to be in the class because I didn't know what other sort of weird stuff was going to happen. Like, I really wanted to go
yeah.
to the. Too often I see students in their third year come up to me and they say, "Oh my God, this is so interesting. I'm doing human evolution with you, Greg, and I do my marketing classes, and God, they're boring, and I don't want to go, and I don't go, and I don't
Yeah.
get good grades,
Yeah.
but I got a marketing major." And you think, well, I got some bad news for you.
Mm,
A marketing major, the most likely thing that you're being, trajectory towards is more marketing. Do the stuff that really fascinates you. The fact is, I think that you can, if you're good at something and if you're fascinated by it, you will find a way to
mm,
make it a reality. I guess that's my lesson is I thought I was just doing something that was fun that I love to do, and that someday I'd have to give it up to do something I didn't love doing,
mm.
but I never had to give up what I love doing.
Yeah.
But
It's a
the only
great
reason
story.
Yeah, the only reason I got to it is because I stuck with it,
Yeah.
And there's plenty of people who say, "Oh, there's no future careers in music." Tell it to the folks playing for the symphony, you know,
Mm,
or
mm,
writing music for commercials or
mm,
movie.
mm,
Like in anthropology, for example, there's so many careers that anthropologists can go into. I've
mm,
got former students working for the Red Cross. They're working for the Roads and Maritime Service.
mm,
They're doing documentary films. They're working in
mm,
TV. They're working for doctors. They're doing epidemiology. There's lots of ways you can do what, but what will separate people, I think, is that passion. Because
mm.
unfortunately, too many people in life are walking around hoping that something just falls in their lap.
Yeah, I agree. I
I
think one of the problems currently in our culture is that this market-driven philosophy has put a lot of people under sedation, and then it
yeah.
locks them into the golden handcuffs.
Yeah, and they're focused on the I don't know, the secondary outcomes.
Mm,
But I'll own a house, I'll own a car, I'll be able to go to restaurants. Yeah, but do you
mm,
like what you're doing every day? You know,
mm,
if you don't like what you're doing every day, no amount of takeaway food is going to make that worth
mm,
it. If you don't like what you're doing every day, having nice interior decoration is not going to make your life better. Do something that makes you, really. And I've been lucky. I've found something I'm really passionate about. I would say that I feel for those folks who never find what they're passionate about. That's the people I worry about most of all. But it's the same. It's the same way with life too. To me, if you're with somebody and you don't really want to be with them, you probably should move on. It's sad to say, but I've talked to plenty of friends who are in couples long term, and they're like, it's just the magic is gone and it's dead at end. Like, well, you want to do this in 5 years? You want to keep doing this in 10 years? Is this the way you want the rest of your life? If you don't make a change, it's not going to change. And whether that change is internal, shaking up what you're doing every day, or whether that change is more profound.
Yeah. Well, Greg, we're coming to the close of our session. Professor Downey, let me thank you.
Gunter, it's my pleasure. It's great to talk to you. And we kind of got off on a jag. I'm not anti-Western. I think what I see around me are every day is good folks, good students. Just unfortunately, we need more options. We need to think about more ways, because one set of clothing, one future, one set of goals doesn't work for everybody.
I'm absolutely on board, because, within Western civilization, there's been tremendous ideas, thoughts, technologies, and so on. But it's how we use it. And this is, this is why I've embarked on this whole thing about inspiring change, and especially in masculinity, because we've locked ourselves down into such a narrow pathway with suffering. I mean, one of the things that I point out, to a lot of men is that, patriarchy is not just about killing women, it's actually killing us. It's not allowing us to thrive the way we could if we just open up and consider differences in being a man.
Yeah. We're like the Labrador at the fence, and the open gate is just a meter to our left or right. But all we can do is look straight through the fence and go, oh my God, there's a fence in my way, instead of just moving down the fence to the gate a little bit.
So again, thanks for participating in this. And, with a little bit, can I persuade you to come back on board?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to come back on board and talk another time about something different. Yeah, it'd be good. It'd be good.
Right. Excellent. Thank you very much. Until next time.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
This is me signing off. Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.gunterswoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda@noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.